They say a home isn't a place, but a feeling. But what happens when that feeling is put up for sale without your knowledge? What happens when the very walls that were meant to protect you suddenly stand as silent witnesses to the most intimate and brutal of betrayals? For Alara Vance, a 38-year-old architect, this wasn't a philosophical question. It was the cold, hard reality of a sun-drenched Tuesday afternoon. She was driving down the familiar tree-lined street of her Connecticut suburb, the engine of her Volvo humming a contented tune that matched the peace in her heart. This was her favorite part of the day, the final turn that led to the house she had not just lived in, but had created, sketching every line, choosing every brick, pouring 12 years of her life and marriage into its foundation. But today, something was wrong. A sharp, jarring slash of red against the green of her perfectly manicured lawn. It was a sign hammered into the earth with an impersonal violence. And on it, a single, four-letter word that made the air in her lungs turn to ice. Sold. For a long moment, she simply sat in her car, the engine still humming, her mind refusing to process the image. It had to be a prank, a tasteless joke by one of their friends, or perhaps a mistake by the real estate agency meant for the house down the street. It had to be anything other than what it was. She finally killed the engine, the sudden silence amplifying the frantic beat of her own heart. With trembling hands, she walked up the stone pathway she had designed herself, her gaze fixed on the sign as if staring at it long enough would make it disappear. But it remained, stark and unmoving. She reached the front door, the solid oak she had chosen for its warmth and strength, and slipped her key into the lock. It wouldn't turn. She tried again, jiggling it, pushing with a growing sense of panic. Nothing. It was then that the door swung open, not with the familiar face of her husband, Mark, but with the annoyed, questioning face of a woman she had never seen before. The woman, perhaps in her late 40s, held a paint swatch in her hand. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone not unkind, but weary, the sound of a person in the middle of a stressful move. Alara's words caught in her throat. I live here," she managed to stammer out, the sentence sounding absurd even to her own ears. The woman's expression shifted from annoyance to pity. "Oh, honey," she said softly, "I think there's been a mistake. We closed on this house this morning." In that instant, the world beneath Alara's feet didn't just crack, it dissolved into nothingness. The feeling of home was gone, replaced by the chilling realization that she was a stranger, standing on her own doorstep, locked out of a life she thought was hers. The betrayal hadn't just knocked on her door, it had changed the locks. To understand the depth of such a betrayal, you must first understand the beauty of what was betrayed. The life Alara and Mark Vance had built was not just a life, it was a masterpiece of appearances, a carefully constructed edifice of success and happiness. At its center was Alara, a woman who found her voice not in loud conversations, but in the quiet, confident lines of a blueprint. She was a creator, an architect whose soul was attuned to the interplay of light and shadow, of space and sanctuary. She wasn't shy, but reserved, possessing a deep well of thought and emotion that she preferred to express through her work rather than through trivial chatter. Her intelligence was sharp but unobtrusive, her presence calming. She saw the world in terms of structure, balance, and integrity, qualities she mistakenly believed were the bedrock of her marriage. And then there was Mark. Mark was the opposite, a man painted in bold, vibrant colors. He was the sun to her serene twilight. They had met in a crowded lecture hall in college. She was sketching a building in the margins of her notebook, and he was captivating a small group with a story, his laughter echoing through the room. He was drawn to her quiet intensity, and she was drawn to his effortless charisma. He was the debater, the aspiring entrepreneur, the man who could walk into any room and leave with a dozen new friends and a handful of business cards. He was all promise and potential. And Alara, with her steady and supportive nature, was the anchor he claimed he needed to turn his grand visions into reality. They were, for over a decade, the perfect couple, a study in complementary opposition. He was the prose, she was the poetry. He made the connections, she built the worlds. Their friends admired them, their families adored them, or so it seemed. They married 2 years after graduation, and for 10 years, they worked towards a singular dream, their home. It wasn't just a house, it was the house. Located on a gentle slope overlooking a quiet lake in rural Connecticut, it was Ilara's magnum opus. She had spent years designing it, pouring all of her professional skill and all of her personal love into its creation. It was a testament to their supposed union. The great room featured a 20-foot ceiling with exposed wooden beams and a floor-to-ceiling glass wall that framed the lake like a living painting, changing with the seasons. She designed it for the parties Mark loved to host, a space that felt both grand and intimate. The kitchen was a sleek, functional marvel where they would cook together, his boisterous chopping a counterpoint to her methodical seasoning. Her studio, tucked away in the east wing, was her sanctuary, a room of pure light and clean lines, where the scent of drafting paper and cedar wood hung in the air. Every detail was a reflection of them. The reclaimed oak floors were chosen for their warmth and history, the cool slate of the fireplace for its strength and permanence. This house was Ilara's soul made visible, and she had offered it freely, believing it was the shared heart of their life together. But in every perfect picture, there is often a shadow just outside the frame. For Ilara, that shadow was Beatrice, Mark's mother. Beatrice was a woman sculpted from disapproval, her compliments always carrying a hidden edge, her smile never quite reaching her eyes. From the beginning, she had viewed Ilara with a thinly veiled suspicion. In her eyes, her brilliant, charismatic son had married a woman who was too plain, too quiet, too intellectual. Mark needs a powerhouse beside him, someone to work the room, Beatrice had once said to a cousin at a family gathering, loud enough for Ilara to hear. Ilara is sweet, of course, but she lives in her own little world of drawings and books. She saw Ilara's reserved nature not as strength, but as a social liability for her ambitious son. Every success Ilara achieved on her own merits was met with faint praise, while every one of Mark's ventures, no matter how risky or ill-conceived, was championed as the work of a genius. Beatrice's love for her son was a suffocating, blinding force that left no room for objectivity, and certainly no room for a daughter-in-law she deemed unworthy. Ilara endured the subtle digs and backhanded compliments with her usual quiet grace, attributing it to a mother's fierce, misguided love. She never complained to Mark, not wanting to put him in the middle, a decision she would one day come to regret with every fiber of her being. She believed that her love, her loyalty, and the beautiful life she was building for them would eventually win Beatrice over. She believed that the foundation of their home and their marriage was strong enough to withstand any external pressure. She failed to realize that the most dangerous threat wasn't coming from the outside, but was sleeping beside her every night, breathing the very air she had so carefully designed their home to hold. The perfect facade was seamless, held together by her unwavering trust and his practiced deception, a beautiful, fragile structure just waiting for the right amount of pressure to collapse into dust. Cracks in a foundation do not appear overnight. They begin as hairline fractures, invisible to the casual observer, tiny fissures that grow under constant, hidden pressure. For Ilara, the pressure began about a year before the sold sign appeared on her lawn, a slow, creeping shift in the tectonic plates of her marriage. It started with the finances. Mark had always handled the bulk of their investments, a role he relished with his characteristic bravado. He spoke of portfolios and market trends with a fluency that Ilara, whose mind worked in the more tangible language of steel and glass, was happy to entrust to him. But the open dialogue they once shared about their financial future began to close. Doors were literally and figuratively shut. His study, once a shared space, became his fortress. He started taking calls in there with the door locked, his voice a low, urgent murmur that would cease the moment he heard her footsteps in the hall. When she would ask about a particular investment, he would wave a dismissive hand. "It's complicated stuff, Ilara. Don't you worry your pretty head about it," he'd say, a phrase that once sounded protective but now felt profoundly patronizing. Mail from financial institutions she didn't recognize would arrive, and before she could even place it on the hall table, he would intercept it, his movements sharp and proprietary. He was building a wall around their shared assets, brick by invisible brick, and she was on the outside. Then came the nights. The business dinners that stretched past midnight, the networking events on weekends. He would come home smelling of expensive whiskey and a faint, floral perfume that wasn't hers. When she would be woken by the sound of his key in the lock at 2 a.m, he would have a story ready, a difficult client, a deal that went into overtime. He would express his exhaustion so theatrically that her concern would override her suspicion, and she would find herself offering him comfort instead of questions. He mastered the art of preemptive defense, complaining about the immense pressure he was under to provide for them, to maintain the beautiful life she had designed. This was his masterstroke of manipulation. He framed his secrecy as a form of protection, a burden he was carrying so she wouldn't have to worry. Her questions were recast not as legitimate concerns, but as added stress, as a lack of faith in him. "Alara, I am killing myself out there for us," he'd say, his voice laced with weary martyrdom. "The last thing I need when I come home is an interrogation. I just need your support. Can you do that for me?" And what could she say? For 12 years, she had been his support. It was the cornerstone of her identity as his wife. To withdraw, it felt like a betrayal, and so she would nod, swallow her doubts, and hate herself for the flicker of suspicion that she couldn't quite extinguish. The gaslighting was a slow poison. He made her doubt her own perceptions, her own sound, logical mind. One evening, she overheard a snippet of a phone call. He was in the garden, and his voice carried on the evening air. "No, she has no idea. The whole thing will be liquidated by then. Just be patient, Chloe." The name hung in the air, foreign and sharp. When she confronted him later, her heart hammering against her ribs, he didn't even blink. He laughed, a short, sharp bark that made her feel foolish. "Chloe? You mean Claude. Claude Dubois, my new French investor. You must have misheard me, honey. Are you feeling all right? You seem on edge lately." He turned it back on her so swiftly, so convincingly, that she was left questioning her own hearing. He suggested she was working too hard, that the stress was making her paranoid. He would do it with a veneer of loving concern that was impossible to fight. He would hold her face in his hands, look her straight in the eye and say, "I'm worried about you. This isn't like you. We're a team, remember? Don't let your imagination create problems that don't exist." He was an artist, and her sanity was his canvas. He painted her as unstable, as imaginative, as untrusting, until she started to believe it herself. The woman who could design a perfectly balanced structure, who could see the flaws in a blueprint from 100 feet away, was suddenly unable to trust the evidence of her own senses. The cracks were no longer invisible. They were spreading across the walls of their perfect life, and yet, whenever she tried to point one out, Mark would simply convince her it was nothing but a shadow, a trick of the light. She was living in a house that was structurally failing, all while its co-architect assured her that the groaning foundation was only the sound of the house settling. The drive away from her own home was a blur. Alara found herself in the parking lot of a sterile-looking strip mall, her car's engine off, the keys still clenched in her white-knuckled fist. The pitying face of the new owner, the cold finality of the useless key, the garish red of the sold sign, the images played on a merciless loop in her mind. Her first instinct, a primal impulse born of 12 years of partnership, was to call Mark. He would fix this. He would be outraged. He would unleash his considerable charm and fury on the incompetent real estate agent and make this nightmare disappear. Her fingers, slick with a cold sweat, fumbled with her phone. He answered on the third ring, his voice smooth as polished stone. "Hey, honey, everything okay?" She explained what had happened, her own voice sounding thin and reedy, the words tumbling out in a rush of panicked disbelief. On the other end of the line, there was a perfectly timed pause, followed by a sharp intake of breath. "What? A sold sign? Are you serious?" He sounded shocked, furious. "That's impossible. It has to be a mistake. Remember that valuation we had done last year? The agency must have gotten their wires crossed. My God, the incompetence. I'm so sorry you had to see that, Ilara. Listen, stay where you are. I'm going to call them right now and tear them a new one. I'll handle it. Don't worry." He was so convincing, so reassuringly angry on her behalf, that for a fleeting, beautiful moment, she believed him. The world righted itself on its axis. It was just a stupid, stressful mistake. But the relief was short-lived, punctured by the memory of the key not working. A mistake with a sign was one thing. A mistake with a lock was another. A cold coil of dread tightened in her stomach, a feeling she had grown accustomed to over the past year, but had always managed to suppress. This time, she didn't push it down. She listened to it. Instead of waiting for Mark's call back, she started her car and drove downtown. Her destination, the county clerk's office. The building was an imposing, soulless block of concrete, a place of cold facts and hard copies. Inside, the air was stale with the smell of old paper and disinfectant. She approached the counter, her voice barely a whisper as she requested the public property records for her own address. The clerk, a woman with tired eyes, took her information with bored indifference and disappeared into a back room. The minutes stretched into an eternity. Ilara's mind raced, creating 1,000 innocent explanations, 1,000 ways this could all be a misunderstanding, each one less plausible than the last. Finally, the clerk returned and slid a thick file across the counter. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She opened it, her hands trembling so violently that the papers rattled. And there it was, a deed of sale, executed 2 weeks prior. The buyers' names were unfamiliar, but the sellers' names were printed in stark, black ink, Mark Vance and Ilara Vance. Her eyes scanned down to the signature lines. There was Mark's familiar, arrogant scrawl, and beneath it was her name, Ilara Vance. It was a ghost of her signature, an almost perfect imitation, but to her architect's eye, the forgery was screamingly obvious. The pressure on the downstroke of the V was too heavy, the loop of the L too precise, too studied. Her own signature was fluid, confident. This was a careful, deliberate tracing, an act of painstaking deception. It was a dead thing on the page, a soulless copy of the real thing, and in that moment, she saw it for what it was, a perfect metaphor for her marriage. She paid for the photocopies, her movements stiff and robotic. She walked out of the building and into the harsh afternoon sun, the truth in her hands feeling heavier than a tombstone. There would be no more phone calls, no more opportunities for him to weave a new tapestry of lies. She drove to a small, clean hotel, checked into a room, and laid the papers out on the pristine bedspread. She sat and stared at them for an hour, the rhythmic pain in her chest hardening into something cold and sharp. Then, she sent Mark a single text message with the hotel's address. "We need to talk. Get here now." When he arrived, he was the very picture of a concerned husband, his face etched with worry. "Ilara, thank God. I was so worried. I've been on the phone all afternoon, those idiots at the realty comp." He stopped mid-sentence. She was standing by the window, her back to him, but he must have seen the papers spread on the bed. He must have seen the look on her face when she finally turned to him. It was a look of absolute stillness, a terrifying calm that was far more damning than any tears or accusations. She didn't speak. She simply nodded toward the bed. He walked over, his confident stride faltering slightly. He looked down at the photocopied deed, at the 2 signatures. The silence in the room was absolute. For a long moment, he said nothing, his mind clearly racing, searching for an escape route, a final lie. But there was none. The proof was there, in black and white. His shoulders slumped. The mask didn't just slip, it shattered. "I was going to tell you," he said, his voice quiet, devoid of its usual charisma. "The business, it was in trouble. Deeper than I told you, we were going to lose everything, Ilara. The house was the only way. I did it to save us." He looked up at her, attempting to conjure tears, to play the desperate man forced into a desperate act. But Ilara wasn't looking at a desperate man. She was looking at a stranger. The man she loved would have come to her, would have faced ruin with her. He would not have stolen her name, her signature, her very soul, and sold it to the highest bidder. The betrayal was so profound, so complete, that it transcended anger and went straight to a place of icy, desolate clarity. "Us?" she said, her voice finally returning, low and steady. "There is no us, Mark. There is only you, and the ruin you've made." He had no reply. In the sterile silence of that hotel room, surrounded by the evidence of his treachery, Alara Vance finally understood. Her husband was gone. Perhaps he had never been there at all. Mark's confession, if one could call it that, hung in the sterile air of the hotel room long after he had gone. It was a story designed to elicit sympathy, to paint him as a fallen hero who had made a terrible choice for a noble reason. For a few hours, in the lonely silence of that room, Alara almost allowed herself to believe it, not to forgive him, but to understand him, to file this catastrophic event under the heading of a desperate act. But her mind, the logical, architect's mind that saw through facades and understood the importance of a solid foundation, simply wouldn't allow it. His story had too many cracks. If the business was failing, where were the late nights of genuine worry? Where were the shared anxieties, the hushed, middle-of-the-night conversations about what they would do next? They never happened. His stress had been a performance, his exhaustion a costume. The man she saw in that hotel room wasn't a desperate husband. He was a bad actor whose show had finally closed. The grief was still there, a heavy, suffocating blanket. But now, a new feeling was pushing through it, cold, clear-eyed suspicion. The lie wasn't the sale of the house. The sale of the house was merely the tip of a much larger, much darker iceberg. 2 days later, Alara found herself in the Spartan office of a man named David Gable, a private investigator whose name she'd gotten from a discreet referral. Gable was a former financial crimes detective, a man with pale, observant eyes and an air of quiet competence that Alara found immediately reassuring. She told him the story, her voice steady and detached, laying out the facts as she knew them, from the locked study to the forged signature. She gave him Mark's name, his business information, and the name she had overheard in the garden, the name Mark had tried to dismiss so easily, Chloe. She wasn't looking for marital dirt. She was looking for the truth, for the full blueprint of his deception. "I need to know everything," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "I need to know where the money went." Gable simply nodded, his expression unreadable. "Leave it with me, Mrs. Vance," was all he said. For the next week, Alara lived in a state of suspended animation, going through the motions of life in her temporary, impersonal apartment. Then, Gable called. "I have something you need to see." In his office, Gable laid a thin file on the desk between them. It wasn't the thick dossier of evidence she expected. It was something cleaner, more clinical. "Your husband's business, Vance Innovative Solutions, was officially dissolved 3 months ago," Gable began, his tone matter-of-fact. He didn't sell the house to save his company. There was no company left to save. For the past 6 months, he's been operating a shell corporation, funneling the last of his investors' money into it. What he's been running isn't a business, Mrs. Vance. It's an exit strategy. Alara felt a wave of nausea. This wasn't a story of failure. It was a story of calculated theft. Mark hadn't been drowning. He had been meticulously packing his luggage for a new life. And then Gable slid a second, thicker file across the desk. "This," he said, his voice softening almost imperceptibly, "is Chloe." The file was full of photographs. The first one was of Mark, laughing, sitting at an outdoor cafe in Soho. Across from him, a young woman with long, blonde hair and a dazzling smile was raising a glass of champagne, her eyes locked on his. Chloe. She was beautiful, vibrant, and looked to be at least 10 years his junior. The next photo showed them walking out of a high-end jewelry store, a small, elegant bag in her hand. Then another, of them stepping into a sleek, black Porsche that Alara had never seen before. They looked happy, carefree, intoxicated with life and with each other. Alara stared at the images, her breath catching in her chest. This was a pain entirely different from the betrayal of the house. This was personal. This was the theft of intimacy, of a shared history. Every late night, every business trip, every secretive phone call now had a face. The vague shape of her anxiety now had a name and a laugh and a glass of champagne. As she numbly flipped through the photos, her architect's eye caught a detail in the background of one of the shots, a building she recognized from an architectural journal, a new, ultra-luxury condominium in Miami. Gable anticipated her question. She lives there. He's been flying down to visit her twice a month for the last 8 months. First class. The final blow came not in a photograph, but in a series of bank statements. Gable had traced the funds from the sale of her home. The money had been wired from the escrow account, not to one of Mark's business accounts, but to an offshore bank in the Cayman Islands. The account was not in the name of Mark Vance. It was in the name of Chloe Taggart. She isn't just his girlfriend, Mrs. Vance, Gable said gently. She's his partner. The entire scheme, the embezzlement, the house. It was all designed to fund their new life together. She's a full participant. Ilara finally looked up from the file, her eyes dry. The grief had been burned away, cauterized by the sheer, unmitigated cruelty of it all. They hadn't just deceived her, they had mocked her. They had toasted their future with champagne while she sat alone in the house she had built, worrying about his stress. They had used her love, her trust, and her very name as the key to unlock their new life. The abyss of his betrayal was deeper than she could ever have imagined. It wasn't just about a house or money. It was about the complete and utter demolition of her reality. And as she sat there, in that quiet office with the truth laid bare before her, Ilara knew one thing with absolute certainty. She wasn't just going to get her house back, she was going to tear theirs down. The legal system, for all its supposed power, moves at a glacial pace. While lawyers filed motions and scheduled hearings, Ilara's life was in a free fall. The new owners of her home, themselves innocent victims in the fraud, were legally entitled to occupy the property until a court ordered otherwise. And so Ilara, the woman who had once commanded spaces of light and beauty, found herself adrift. She moved into a furnished one-bedroom apartment on the edge of town, a place so profoundly generic, it felt like an insult. The walls were a color she could only describe as landlord beige. The furniture was flimsy and uncomfortable, chosen for its durability rather than its comfort. Her window looked out not onto a serene lake, but onto the grimy brick wall of the adjacent building. Every morning, she would wake up in a strange bed, the silence of the small apartment pressing in on her, a stark contrast to the open, airy silence of the home she had created. The apartment was a constant, tangible reminder of her new status. She was no longer Ilara Vance, esteemed architect and wife. She was a displaced person, a ghost haunting the periphery of a life that had been stolen from her. But the loss of her home was only the beginning of her exile. While Ilara was grappling with the logistics of her shattered existence, Mark and his mother, Beatrice, were already launching a preemptive strike, not with lawyers, but with whispers. They were engaged in a quiet, vicious war for the narrative, and Ilara, in her state of shock and grief, was an unarmed combatant. Mark, ever the charismatic victim, was masterful. He reached out to their mutual friends, his voice thick with a carefully rehearsed sorrow. He told them that he and Ilara were separating, that she had been struggling with her mental health for some time, becoming paranoid and unstable. The house, he explained with a heavy sigh, had to be sold to protect their assets from her impulsive decisions during the divorce. He painted a picture of a loving husband forced to make an impossible choice to save his wife from herself. He was heartbroken, he claimed, not just by the end of their marriage, but by her tragic decline. Beatrice, meanwhile, played the role of the devastated mother to perfection. She would call old family friends, her voice trembling with tears, recounting stories of Ilara's erratic behavior and frightening accusations. She would speak of Mark's boundless patience, his saintly attempts to get Ilara help, all of which had been rejected. "We are just so worried for her," Beatrice would conclude, her words dripping with false compassion. "My poor son has the weight of the world on his shoulders." Together, they wove a story that was both plausible and poisonous. It preyed on people's discomfort with mental illness and their willingness to believe the more socially powerful party. It was a masterpiece of character assassination, and it worked with terrifying efficiency. The calls to Ilara slowed, then stopped altogether. Friends she had known for over a decade would see her in the grocery store and suddenly become intensely interested in a display of canned beans, or they would offer a tight, pitying smile and a hurried hello before rushing away. She was being ostracized, erased from the community she had called home. The silence from her phone was a constant scream, a testament to her new reality as a pariah. Her lowest point came on a rainy Thursday evening. She was unpacking one of the few boxes she had managed to take from the house, a box of old photos and memories. Her hand closed around a silver picture frame. It was a photo of her and Mark, taken the day they broke ground on the house. They were standing on the empty plot of land, arms around each other, grinning at the camera, their faces alight with hope and shared dreams. He was pointing to the spot where their living room would be, and she was laughing, her head thrown back in pure, unadulterated joy. The memory, once a source of warmth, was now an artifact of a lie so profound it stole the air from her lungs. A sob, raw and ragged, tore itself from her throat. It was the first time she had truly cried since that first day. She sank to the floor of that beige, soulless apartment, clutching the photograph to her chest, and wept for the woman in the picture, for her innocence, for her foolish, trusting heart. She wept for the life that had been a lie, for the friends who had abandoned her, for the utter, crushing loneliness that was now her only companion. In that moment, she felt the full weight of their campaign against her. Maybe they were right. Maybe she was crazy. What kind of sane person doesn't see the truth of their own life? The doubt, the seed they had so carefully planted, had taken root in the fertile soil of her despair. She was isolated, grieving, and beginning to doubt her own sanity. She had hit rock bottom. And as she sat there, on the cold floor in the dark, she knew that she had a choice. She could let the darkness swallow her whole, or she could start looking for a flicker of light, a spark of retribution to burn their whole world down. The morning after the storm of her grief broke, Alara woke to a strange and unnerving quiet, not in the apartment, but inside her own head. The chaotic symphony of pain, self-doubt, and despair had faded, leaving behind a vast, empty silence. She felt hollowed out, scoured clean by her own sorrow. There were no more tears to cry. She moved through the day like an automaton, making coffee, showering, and finally, forcing herself to sit at the small desk in the corner of the room. Her lawyer had asked for a timeline, for any documents, emails, or receipts that might be relevant. It was a mundane, soul-crushing task, sifting through the digital detritus of a life that was no longer hers. For hours, she sorted through files on her laptop, vacation itineraries, dinner reservations, emails from friends who no longer spoke to her. Each one was a small, sharp paper cut on her already wounded soul. It was in a folder labeled Home Renovations and Security that she saw it. A PDF receipt from an electronics store, dated 9 months earlier. The item description read, Nighthawk Smart Security Kit, 3-camera pack. The memory came back to her, not in a flash, but in a slow, creeping wave. There had been a string of minor break-ins in their neighborhood. A car stereo stolen here, a few garden tools there. Mark had been dismissive, but Alara, ever the planner, had been proactive. She'd bought the kit herself. She'd installed one camera covering the front door and another watching the back patio. The third one, a small, discreet, cube-shaped camera, she had placed on the highest shelf in her studio, nestled between thick architectural textbooks. Her reasoning had been simple and practical. Her studio housed thousands of dollars worth of computer equipment, plotters, and, most importantly, her life's work. The camera was to protect her professional assets. It was never meant to watch the people inside the house. She had set it up to record motion-activated clips to a cloud server, checked it once to make sure it was working, and then, in the course of daily life, she had completely forgotten it was there. Until now. A flicker of something not quite hope, but a sharp, electric curiosity cut through her numbness. Her fingers flew across the keyboard as she searched for the Nighthawk app login page. Her mind raced. What might it have captured? A strange visitor? A phone call? Anything to corroborate the story she was building? She found the website, her breath catching as she tried to recall the password. After 2 failed attempts, she finally remembered the ridiculously complex sequence of letters and numbers she had chosen. The interface loaded, a calendar and a series of time-stamped video files. Her heart began to beat again, a slow, heavy drum against her ribs. She started scrolling back, month by month. Most of the clips were useless. Hours of an empty room, the light shifting as the sun moved across the sky. Occasionally, a clip would show her walking through, grabbing a book, or sitting at her desk. It was a tedious, disheartening process. Days turned into weeks on the digital calendar. She was about to give up, to dismiss the idea as another desperate, grasping hope, when she saw a strange cluster of activity logs from about 2 months ago. Several recordings, all between the hours of 2 and 4 in the morning. Her hand trembled as she clicked on the first file, timestamped 3:17 a.m. The video was grainy, illuminated only by the soft glow of the desk lamp she always left on. For a moment, there was nothing but the silent, sleeping room. Then, a figure moved into the frame. It was Mark. He was in his pajamas, his hair disheveled. He looked haggard, hunted. He moved with a strange, furtive energy, his eyes darting towards the doorway, as if he expected to be caught at any moment. He sat down at her desk, in her chair. On it, he placed 2 documents. One was a letter from her alumni association, a form she had signed and left on the desk to mail the next day. The other was a blank sheet of paper from her high-quality linen stationery, the kind she used for important correspondence. He picked up her favorite fountain pen, the one he had given her for their 10th anniversary, and then, under the single pool of light, he began to practice. The camera, silent and unseen, recorded everything. It recorded the way he angled the letter to study her signature. It recorded the slow, deliberate scratching of the pen as he tried to replicate the loops and curves of her name. It recorded his small grunt of frustration as he crumpled up a failed attempt and tossed it aside. He did it again, and again, and again. The clip was only 3 minutes long, but it felt like an eternity. Finally, after a dozen attempts, he produced one that seemed to satisfy him. He held it up to the light, comparing it to her real signature, a small, cruel smile of triumph touching his lips. He placed the forgery into a folder, gathered the crumpled failures, and walked out of the frame, disappearing back into the shadows of the house. Elara didn't move. She didn't breathe. She just stared at the empty, silent room on the screen. There was no surge of triumphant rage, no cry of vindication. Instead, a profound and terrifying calm washed over her. The emotional storm had passed, and in its wake was an arctic stillness. The grief, the pain, the self-doubt, it all froze, solidifying into something new. Something hard and sharp and unbreakable. She clicked download, her movements precise and deliberate. She watched the progress bar crawl across the screen, securing the digital file that contained the death of her marriage and the rebirth of her resolve. Mark and Beatrice had painted her as unhinged, as a paranoid woman lost in her imagination. They had isolated her and tried to break her spirit. They had underestimated her. They had forgotten that she was an architect. She knew that the strongest structures are built to withstand the greatest pressures. And she now understood that before you can build something new, you must first have a detailed, undeniable blueprint of the old structure's collapse. She now had that blueprint, and she was going to use it to bring the entire rotten edifice of his life crashing down around him. The downloaded video file sat on Elara's laptop desktop, a small, innocuous icon that held the power of a neutron bomb. Her first instinct, a primal urge for immediate release, was to send it. To forward it to Mark, to Beatrice, to every friend who had abandoned her, with a single, blazing subject line, Lear. She imagined their faces, the shock, the dawning horror, the pathetic scramble to craft a new narrative. The fantasy was sweet, a momentary taste of vengeance that was almost intoxicating. But the new Elara, the one forged in the icy silence of her grief, resisted. She understood something fundamental now. A bomb is most powerful not when it is brandished, but when it is detonated at the precise moment of maximum impact. To show her hand now would be to give them time to prepare, to concoct a new lie about the video being faked or taken out of context. No. This weapon would remain in its silo, a secret known only to her, until the moment it could guarantee total annihilation. The next morning, she walked into her lawyer's office. Mrs. Davison was a woman in her late 50s with sharp, intelligent eyes and a demeanor that radiated a calm, lethal competence. Alara didn't speak. She simply opened her laptop, turned it around on the desk, and pressed play. Mrs. Davison watched the 3-minute clip in absolute silence, her expression unreadable. She didn't gasp. She didn't exclaim in shock. When the video ended, she simply folded her hands on her desk and looked at Alara, a flicker of something that looked like profound respect in her eyes. "Well, Mrs. Vance," she said, her voice a low, steady hum. "This is no longer a divorce proceeding. This is a demolition." She confirmed Alara's instinct about secrecy. "We do not mention this video. We don't allude to it. We don't even whisper about it in our sleep. As far as Mark Vance and his counsel are concerned, this does not exist. We will let him build his entire defense on the lie that you are unstable, and he is the victim. We will let him climb as high as he can on that pedestal of deceit, so that when we kick it out from under him, the fall will be absolute." With that, the war room was established. Alara's small beige apartment became the headquarters for a meticulously planned offensive. The video was their centerpiece, their queen on the chessboard, but a queen needs an army. Mrs. Davison insisted they build an ironclad, multi-layered case around it. First, they integrated the work of the private investigator, David Gable. His files were a treasure trove of motive. The photos of Mark and Chloe living their lavish life, the first-class flight receipts, the bank statements from the Cayman Islands. All of it was laid out and cross-referenced, creating a perfect timeline of betrayal. They could now match the exact date of a large cash withdrawal from Chloe's account with an Instagram post showing her wearing a new diamond bracelet. They could align Mark's business trips to Miami with the precise dates Alara was left alone, worrying about his supposed stress. Each piece of evidence was a nail they would hammer into his coffin. But Mrs. Davison wanted more. "He's going to portray this as a simple marital infidelity. A mistake made by a man under pressure," the lawyer explained, pacing her office. "We need to show the court that this is not an aberration. This is his character. We need to establish a pattern of fraud." And so, Alara had a new mission. She went back through old emails, through years of conversations, searching for any mention of Mark's past business partners, especially those whose partnerships had ended abruptly. Her architect's memory, which could recall the specific load-bearing capacity of a steel beam from a decade-old project, now proved to be a formidable forensic tool. She remembered a name, a man named Robert Foster, an early investor in Mark's first startup who had left the company under a cloud of bitterness years ago. Mark had claimed Foster was incompetent, but Alara now saw the story through a different lens. With Gable's help, they found him. Robert Foster was now a high school chemistry teacher, a man whose entrepreneurial dreams had been shattered. When they sat down with him, his story was chillingly familiar. He told them how Mark had systematically pushed him out, manipulating financial records and draining the company's assets into a private account before dissolving the business, leaving Foster with nothing but debt. He had never had enough proof to sue. Until now. Foster was just the first. They found 2 other investors from a more recent venture, both of whom had been swindled by Mark's charm and empty promises. They were angry, embarrassed, and more than willing to provide sworn affidavits. Alara's life became a clinical exercise in evidence gathering. The emotional, grieving wife was gone, replaced by a cold, efficient strategist. She spent her nights not weeping, but staring at spreadsheets, the glow of the screen illuminating her focused, hardened features. The pain was still there, a low-frequency hum beneath the surface, but it was no longer a debilitating force. It was fuel. It was the engine driving her forward. She and Mrs. Davison assembled their arsenal into a series of thick, meticulously organized binders. Binder 1, the forgery. It contained a high-definition copy of the video, a sworn statement from a forensic handwriting expert confirming the signature was fraudulent, and the official deed of sale. Binder 2, the motive. This held the photos of Mark and Chloe, the travel records, the offshore bank statements. Binder 3, the pattern. This contained the signed affidavits from Robert Foster and the other defrauded investors, along with supporting financial documents. It was a mountain of irrefutable proof, a legal fortress from which there was no escape. Standing in her lawyer's office, looking at the binders lined up on the conference table, Alara felt the last of her fear fall away. This was no longer just about getting her house back. It was about justice. It was about taking back not just her property, but her name, her sanity, and her story. The trap was set. All they had to do now was wait for the arrogant, unsuspecting prey to walk right into it. The wheels of justice grind slowly, and in the intervening months between filing the lawsuit and the first day in court, a new kind of warfare began. This was the pre-trial phase, a meticulous and often brutal landscape of depositions and preliminary hearings where narratives are built and defenses are tested. It was a stage perfectly suited to Mark Vance's talents. He arrived at his deposition, dressed not in a flashy suit, but in a somber navy blazer and gray trousers, an outfit carefully chosen to project an air of beleaguered sincerity. He was the very picture of a man wronged, his handsome face etched with a convincing sadness. Opposite him sat Mrs. Davison, her expression as unyielding as granite. Alara sat beside her, a silent, still observer. From the moment he was sworn in, Mark began his performance. He spoke in a low, regretful tone, weaving the story he and his mother had so carefully crafted. He referred to Alara not with anger, but with a deep, paternalistic pity. "Did you sell the house located at 142 Willow Lake Drive without your wife's consent?" Mrs. Davison asked, her voice flat and devoid of accusation. Mark let out a long, pained sigh. He looked not at the lawyer, but at Alara, his eyes brimming with a manufactured sorrow. "Consent is a complicated word," he began, his voice soft. "Did Alara sign the papers? No. But did we have an understanding? 100 understandings. Our marriage? It had been under strain for some time. Alara? She hasn't been herself for a while. She was prone to episodes, paranoia, deep depressions followed by periods of manic spending. We were sinking, and she refused to see it. The sale of the house was an act of desperation. Yes, but it was an act of preservation. I had to make the hard choice for both of us, to save what little we had left before her instability, led us to utter ruin. It was a brilliant lie, delivered with heartbreaking conviction." He never raised his voice. He seemed to be in genuine pain, a man forced to reveal the tragic secret of his wife's mental decline to save himself. His lawyer, a sharp, aggressive man named Peterson, interjected at all the right moments, objecting to Mrs. Davison's more pointed questions as harassment of his grieving client. They were a seamless team, painting a portrait of Alara as a fragile, volatile woman who had lost her grip on reality. Beatrice's deposition was even more theatrical. She arrived dressed in black, as if attending a funeral, dabbing at her dry eyes with a silk handkerchief. She spoke of Alara's early days in the family with a tone of fond regret. "I always knew she was a delicate thing," Beatrice whispered, her voice cracking, so creative but so sensitive. "In her own world." She then proceeded to invent a litany of supporting anecdotes, each one a small, poisonous dart. She spoke of a dinner party where Alara had supposedly locked herself in a bathroom for an hour, convinced another guest had stolen her necklace, which was later found in her own purse. She recounted a phone call where Alara had allegedly sobbed hysterically, accusing Mark of having an affair with a bank teller simply because he had been late from work. The stories were all fiction, but they were detailed, specific, and delivered with the unimpeachable authority of a concerned mother-in-law. "My son, my Mark," she concluded, her voice thick with tears. "He protected her. He covered for her for years. He has the patience of a saint. But this time, she went too far. And now she's trying to destroy him out of pure spite. It breaks my heart." Through it all, Alara remained silent, her face an unreadable mask of composure. When it was her turn to be deposed, she followed Mrs. Davison's instructions to the letter. She was polite, her voice was even, and her answers were brief and factual. Peterson, Mark's lawyer, tried to bait her, to provoke the emotional, hysterical reaction that Mark and Beatrice had described. "Mrs. Vance, isn't it true that you have a history of making baseless, jealous accusations against your husband?" he asked, his tone dripping with condescension. "No, that is not true," Alara replied, her gaze steady. "Isn't it a fact that you once accused your mother-in-law of intentionally trying to exclude you from family events?" "No," Alara said calmly. "That is not a fact. So you stand here today, under oath, and claim that your husband, a respected businessman, and his loving mother are both lying?" "I stand here today to tell the truth," Alara said, her voice unwavering. "Their testimony is not truthful." Her calmness was her greatest weapon, though she didn't know it at the time. Mark and his lawyer mistook her composure for defeat. They saw a woman who was beaten down, who had no evidence, no fight left in her. After her deposition, Alara saw them in the hallway. Peterson clapped Mark on the shoulder, a wide, confident grin on his face. Mark caught Alara's eye and gave her a small, pitying shake of his head, the look of a man who had already won. They were completely, blissfully unaware that they weren't just misreading her. They were walking, step by confident step, into a perfectly designed, perfectly executed ambush. The stage was set, their lies had been entered into the official record, and their arrogance was at its peak. Everything was going according to Alara's plan. The day of the trial arrived not with a storm, but with a cold, sterile quiet. The courtroom was a theater of polished wood and hushed reverence, a place where lives were dissected under the unflinching gaze of a bored-looking bailiff and a formidable judge. Alara sat beside Mrs. Davison, a small, still island of calm in a sea of tension. Across the room, Mark sat with his lawyer, whispering confidently, even managing a small, reassuring smile for his mother, who was seated in the front row of the gallery, her face a mask of anxious devotion. When Mark was called to the stand, he walked with the easy confidence of a man who believed his own lies. He took the oath, placed his hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, an act of perjury so blatant it was almost breathtaking. His lawyer, Peterson, led him gently through their rehearsed narrative. Mark spoke of his deep love for Alara, his voice thick with emotion. He described her supposed instability with a tone of profound sadness, painting himself as the long-suffering husband who had finally been forced to act. "I did it to protect her," he said, his eyes glistening as he looked towards the judge. "To protect us. It was the hardest decision of my life, but I would do it again to save my family from ruin." He was magnificent, a true artist of deceit. When Peterson finished, a palpable wave of sympathy for Mark rippled through the courtroom. Then, Mrs. Davison rose to cross-examine. She approached the stand not like a predator, but like a scientist approaching a specimen. Her voice was quiet, her questions simple. "Mr. Vance, just to be clear for the court, you are testifying that your wife, Alara, was mentally and emotionally unstable?" "Regrettably, yes," Mark said, sighing. "And because of this instability, she was incapable of making sound financial decisions?" "That's correct. She was unpredictable. So you forged her signature on the deed of sale as a last resort, an act of protection?" Peterson jumped to his feet. "Objection. The word forged assumes a fact not in evidence." "Sustained," the judge said. Mrs. Davison simply nodded. "Apologies, Your Honor. Let me rephrase. Mr. Vance, you signed your wife's name on the deed of sale yourself without her knowledge or explicit permission?" Mark squared his shoulders. "Yes. As I said, it was a necessary and heartbreaking step to protect our shared assets." Mrs. Davison let the answer hang in the air for a moment before moving on. She then projected a series of documents onto the large screen facing the jury box. They were bank statements. "Mr. Vance, you testified your actions were due to extreme financial distress. Is this your account statement showing a wire transfer of over $1 million, the proceeds from the house sale to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands?" Mark shifted in his seat. "That was a business liquidity measure. A business you had already dissolved," Mrs. Davison countered flatly. "And this offshore account, it's in the name of a Miss Chloe Taggart. Can you tell the court who she is?" Mark's face paled slightly. "She's a business consultant." Mrs. Davison then displayed a photograph. It was Mark and Chloe, laughing, clinking champagne glasses in Miami. "Does she often consult for you in a bikini, Mr. Vance?" The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Peterson was on his feet, objecting furiously, but the damage was done. The first crack in Mark's perfect facade had appeared. Mrs. Davison let the chaos settle. She walked back to her table, took a sip of water, creating a moment of pure, agonizing suspense. "Your Honor," she said, her voice ringing with a new clarity and power. "The plaintiff has one final piece of evidence to present at this time. We would like to play a short video." The judge, now leaning forward with keen interest, nodded. "Proceed." A court officer set up the screen. A heavy silence fell over the room. Alara felt 100 pairs of eyes on her, but she kept her own gaze fixed on her husband. Mark's confident smirk had vanished, replaced by a flicker of confusion and unease. He had no idea what was coming. Then, the video played. The grainy, 3:17 a.m. footage filled the screen, the silent room, the desk lamp, and Mark. The entire courtroom watched as Mark Vance, the concerned husband, the pillar of the community, sat down and meticulously, obsessively, practiced forging his wife's name. The scratching sound of the pen seemed to echo in the dead silent room. They saw him crumple the failures. They saw him compare his work. They saw the small, triumphant smile on his face when he finally got it right. A collective gasp went through the gallery. Beatrice made a sound like a small, wounded animal. Peterson, Mark's lawyer, stared at the screen, his mouth agape, the color draining from his face. He had been played, and he knew it. But the most dramatic reaction was on the stand. Mark Vance had frozen, his face a grotesque mask of disbelief and horror. The blood had drained from his head, leaving his skin a pasty, sickly gray. He looked as if he had seen his own ghost. The video ended, but the image of his crime hung in the air like a toxic fog. Mrs. Davison approached the stand one last time. Her voice was no longer quiet. It was cold, hard, and utterly unforgiving. "Mr. Vance," she said, the words striking him like physical blows. "Was that you in the video?" Mark opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He could only nod, a pathetic, jerky movement. "And was that your wife's signature you were tracing? The very signature you swore to this court you were forced to replicate in a moment of desperate love?" He was shaking now, his eyes darting around the room, looking for an escape that wasn't there. You don't understand," he stammered. "Mrs. Davison took a final step closer, her voice dropping to a low, lethal whisper that every person in the room could hear. "Oh, I think for the first time, Mr. Vance, everyone in this room understands perfectly. We understand that you are not a victim. You are a predator. You are not a protector. You are a thief. And you are not just a liar, but a perjurer." She turned to the judge. "No further questions for this witness, Your Honor." Mark Vance finally broke. He slumped forward in the witness box, burying his face in his hands, his body racked with dry, pathetic sobs. The perfect facade had not just cracked, it had been utterly and publicly obliterated, leaving nothing behind but the ugly, pathetic truth. The aftermath of Mark's confession on the stand was not the chaotic shouting match one might see in a movie. It was something far more chilling, a heavy, suffocating silence. Mark's pathetic sobs were the only sound, each one an admission of guilt that echoed in the stunned courtroom. The judge, a man who had seen decades of human fallibility, looked down at Mark, not with anger, but with a profound and icy contempt. He cleared his throat, and the sound cut through the tension like a guillotine. "Mr. Vance," the judge said, his voice cold and resonant, "in all my years on this bench, I have rarely witnessed a performance of such calculated, malicious deceit. You have not only committed fraud against your wife, but you have also committed an assault on the very integrity of this court." He looked from Mark to Alara, then back again. "The judgment of this court is immediate and unequivocal. The sale of the property at 142 Willow Lake Drive is hereby declared null and void, predicated on felony fraud and forgery. The deed is to be immediately restored to the sole ownership of the plaintiff, Miss Alara Vance." He wasn't finished. He removed his glasses, polishing them slowly as he delivered the final, devastating blow. "Furthermore, this court finds sufficient evidence of multiple criminal acts. I am therefore referring this entire matter, including the complete transcripts of this hearing and all evidence presented to the District Attorney's Office for immediate criminal investigation on charges, including, but not limited to, aggravated forgery, wire fraud, and felony perjury. The word perjury landed like a physical object in the room. Mark's head snapped up, his face a mask of pure terror. This was no longer about money or a house, this was about prison. His lawyer, Peterson, looked pale and sick, already distancing himself from his client, as if from a contagion. As the judge banged his gavel, two bailiffs moved with quiet efficiency toward the witness stand. They didn't put him in handcuffs then and there, but their presence was an unmistakable statement. Mark Vance was no longer a respected businessman, he was a criminal in custody. As they escorted him past the gallery, he looked broken, his arrogance and charm stripped away, leaving only a hollow, terrified shell of a man. His eyes desperately sought out his mother's. Beatrice sat frozen in her seat, her face ashen. She looked like a statue that had been shattered and hastily glued back together. The whispers around her were merciless. The women she had served on charity committees with, the friends she had played bridge with, they all stared at her, their eyes filled with a mixture of pity and scorn. She had not just been lied to by her son, she had actively, proudly participated in his lies, and her public humiliation was as swift and as absolute as his. She was now the mother of a con man, a forger, a perjurer. Her carefully constructed world of social standing and maternal pride had been demolished in the space of a single 3-minute video. In the days that followed, the final pieces of Mark's duplicitous life fell into place. A call from David Gable, the private investigator, confirmed what Alara already suspected. Chloe Taggart had vanished. An hour after the news of the verdict and the criminal referral had hit the press, the entire balance of the Cayman Islands account had been wired to another, untraceable account in Singapore. Chloe, the loyal partner, the lover for whom Mark had thrown everything away, had cut him loose the moment he was no longer useful. She had played her own game, and in the end, she had won the only prize she ever cared about: the money. She left Mark to face the consequences of their shared crimes completely, utterly alone. The news barely registered with Alara. Chloe was a symptom, not the disease. A week later, Alara stood on the doorstep of her house. Her house. The key, a new one freshly cut, slid into the lock and turned with a satisfying click. The door swung open and she stepped inside. The new owners had already moved out, leaving the space eerily empty, a hollow shell that echoed with every footstep. It was exactly as she had designed it, the light pouring through the great glass wall, the warm oak floors stretching out before her. She had won. She had gotten it all back, but the feeling she expected, triumph, relief, joy, was absent. All she felt was a profound and aching emptiness. She walked through the rooms, each one a mausoleum of a dead marriage. Here was the kitchen where he had once made her laugh so hard she cried. There was the spot by the fireplace where he had proposed to her. Here was the studio where she had worked late into the night, designing this very space, believing she was building a sanctuary for their shared love. Every memory was now tainted. Every happy moment recontextualized as a scene in a long, elaborate play in which only she had not known her lines were lies. She had taken back the property, but the feeling of home was gone, perhaps forever. It had been violated, sold off, and the spirit of the place had been broken. The victory felt not like a celebration, but like the quiet, somber work of a battlefield medic after the fighting is over. The enemy was vanquished, but the landscape was scarred and littered with the ghosts of what used to be. She had her house back, but she had lost her home. And as she stood alone in the cavernous silence of the great room, Alara knew the legal battle was over, but the far more difficult work of rebuilding a life from the ruins was just beginning. The aftermath of Mark's confession on the stand was not the chaotic shouting match one might see in a movie. It was something far more chilling, a heavy, suffocating silence. Mark's pathetic sobs were the only sound, each one an admission of guilt that echoed in the stunned courtroom. The judge, a man who had seen decades of human fallibility, looked down at Mark, not with anger, but with a profound and icy contempt. He cleared his throat, and the sound cut through the tension like a guillotine. "Mr. Vance," the judge said, his voice cold and resonant. "In all my years on this bench, I have rarely witnessed a performance of such calculated, malicious deceit. You have not only committed fraud against your wife, but you have also committed an assault on the very integrity of this court." He looked from Mark to Alara, then back again. "The judgment of this court is immediate and unequivocal. The sale of the property at 142 Willow Lake Drive is hereby declared null and void, predicated on felony fraud and forgery. The deed is to be immediately restored to the sole ownership of the plaintiff, Miss Alara Vance." He wasn't finished. He removed his glasses, polishing them slowly as he delivered the final, devastating blow. "Furthermore, this court finds sufficient evidence of multiple criminal acts. I am therefore referring this entire matter, including the complete transcripts of this hearing and all evidence presented to the District Attorney's Office for immediate criminal investigation on charges, including, but not limited to, aggravated forgery, wire fraud, and felony perjury." The word perjury landed like a physical object in the room. Mark's head snapped up, his face a mask of pure terror. This was no longer about money or a house. This was about prison. His lawyer, Peterson, looked pale and sick, already distancing himself from his client as if from a contagion. As the judge banged his gavel, two bailiffs moved with quiet efficiency toward the witness stand. They didn't put him in handcuffs then and there, but their presence was an unmistakable statement. Mark Vance was no longer a respected businessman. He was a criminal in custody. As they escorted him past the gallery, he looked broken, his arrogance and charm stripped away, leaving only a hollow, terrified shell of a man. His eyes desperately sought out his mother's. Beatrice sat frozen in her seat, her face ashen. She looked like a statue that had been shattered and hastily glued back together. The whispers around her were merciless. The women she had served on charity committees with, the friends she had played bridge with, they all stared at her, their eyes filled with a mixture of pity and scorn. She had not just been lied to by her son. She had actively, proudly participated in his lies, and her public humiliation was as swift and as absolute as his. She was now the mother of a con man, a forger, a perjurer. Her carefully constructed world of social standing and maternal pride had been demolished in the space of a single 3-minute video. In the days that followed, the final pieces of Mark's duplicitous life fell into place. A call from David Gable, the private investigator, confirmed what Alara already suspected. Chloe Taggart had vanished. An hour after the news of the verdict and the criminal referral had hit the press, the entire balance of the Cayman Islands account had been wired to another, untraceable account in Singapore. Chloe, the loyal partner, the lover for whom Mark had thrown everything away, had cut him loose the moment he was no longer useful. She had played her own game, and in the end, she had won the only prize she ever cared about: the money. She left Mark to face the consequences of their shared crimes completely, utterly alone. The news barely registered with Alara. Chloe was a symptom, not the disease. A week later, Alara stood on the doorstep of her house. Her house, the key, a new one freshly cut, slid into the lock and turned with a satisfying click. The door swung open, and she stepped inside. The new owners had already moved out, leaving the space eerily empty, a hollow shell that echoed with every footstep. It was exactly as she had designed it, the light pouring through the great glass wall, the warm oak floors stretching out before her. She had won. She had gotten it all back. But the feeling she expected, triumph, relief, joy, was absent. All she felt was a profound and aching emptiness. She walked through the rooms, each one a mausoleum of a dead marriage. Here was the kitchen, where he had once made her laugh so hard she cried. There was the spot by the fireplace where he had proposed to her. Here was the studio where she had worked late into the night, designing this very space, believing she was building a sanctuary for their shared love. Every memory was now tainted, every happy moment recontextualized as a scene in a long, elaborate play in which only she had not known her lines were lies. She had taken back the property, but the feeling of home was gone, perhaps forever. It had been violated, sold off, and the spirit of the place had been broken. The victory felt not like a celebration, but like the quiet, somber work of a battlefield medic after the fighting is over. The enemy was vanquished, but the landscape was scarred and littered with the ghosts of what used to be. She had her house back, but she had lost her home. And as she stood alone in the cavernous silence of the great room, Alara knew the legal battle was over, but the far more difficult work of rebuilding a life from the ruins was just beginning. The weeks that followed the verdict were a blur of quiet, methodical cleansing. Alara moved through her reclaimed house like a groundskeeper in a beautiful, haunted cemetery, tending to the final affairs of a life that had been buried. The most difficult task, the one she had saved for last, was clearing out Mark's study. It had been his command center, the room where he had woven his webs of deceit, and it still felt permeated with the ghost of his presence. She packed his expensive, unread books into boxes for donation. She threw out his collection of ostentatious pens and leather-bound journals filled with his arrogant, looping script. She worked with a detached efficiency, her heart carefully walled off from the memories that threatened to surface with every object she touched. Finally, all that was left was his leather briefcase, an expensive gift she had given him for his 35th birthday. It was sitting on the floor by the desk, forgotten. She picked it up, intending to put it in the box with his other personal effects, but it felt oddly heavy, unbalanced. She opened it. It was empty, save for a few old business cards. Yet the weight remained. Her architect's sense for structure and detail, the very quality he had underestimated in her, kicked in. She ran her fingers along the velvet lining at the bottom. And there, beneath a perfectly seamless flap, she felt the faint outline of a hidden latch. With a click that sounded deafening in the silent house, a false bottom sprang open, revealing a slim, hidden compartment. Inside was a single, thick manila envelope. Her blood ran cold. She knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that whatever was in this envelope was the final piece of the puzzle, the keystone of his entire monstrous architecture of lies. Her hands were surprisingly steady as she pulled out the contents. The first document was a life insurance policy. Her name, Ilara Catherine Vance, was listed as the insured party. The death benefit was for $2 million. Her eyes scanned down the page to the section marked Beneficiary. It was not Mark. The sole beneficiary was listed as Chloe Taggart. The policy had been taken out 6 months ago, and the first annual premium had been paid in full. The date the policy was set to become active, to be in full, indisputable effect, was next Tuesday. A week from today, she felt a wave of dizziness, a surreal sense of detachment, as if she were reading a script from a bad thriller. But it was the second item in the envelope that made the air in her lungs crystallize into shards of ice. It was a small, torn piece of paper, a note from a disposable scratch pad. The handwriting was Mark's. It contained only 10 words, but these 10 words reframed her entire reality. Check brakes on the Volvo. Must look like an accident. In that instant, the final, horrifying truth crashed down upon her. The sale of the house, the embezzlement, the affair, they weren't the endgame. They were just the setup. This was the real plan. He wasn't just trying to leave her. He was planning to erase her. He would have let her suffer through the humiliation of losing her home, let her friends abandon her, let her be painted as an unstable wreck. And then, when she was at her most isolated, at her most broken, her car would fail on a quiet country road. A tragic accident. A grieving husband, left with nothing but his memories and, unbeknownst to anyone, a $2 million payout to his lover. The forgery video hadn't just saved her home. It had, in all likelihood, saved her life. She sank into the chair at the desk. The documents spread before her, and for the first time, she saw the full, terrifying dimensions of the monster she had married. He had not just been unfaithful. He had not just been a thief. He had been a predator, calmly and patiently stalking her, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Her silence, her quiet suffering, her decision to retreat and observe rather than to scream and fight it, had been his undoing. He had mistaken her stillness for surrender, her silence for weakness. He never imagined that while he was plotting her end, she was quietly, meticulously plotting his. She looked out the window of her studio, her gaze falling on the serene, silver surface of the lake. The house was no longer a mausoleum. It was a fortress. It was the place she had not only defended, but the place that had, in the end, defended her. She picked up her phone, her fingers steady as she dialed Mrs. Davison's number. There was one more crime to report. She thought of all the lies, all the manipulation, all the pain, and a final, chilling thought settled in her mind. Never, ever underestimate the silence of a person who has endured for too long. Because within that silence, they are not just absorbing the pain. They are listening, they are learning, they are watching, and they are waiting for the perfect moment to show you exactly who you are. The criminal trial of Mark Vance would be another story, a tale of justice in a different court for a far darker crime. But that is a story for another night. Thank you for listening.